What is mathematical logic? The book came about because of Melbourne University philosophers. I should perhaps say philosophy students wanting to know more about the subject. That was in 1970, 2 or 3 years after I first started thinking about Australia. At that time, there were very few logicians in the country. I think just 2. Rod might be able to correct me on that. I'd been in Oxford in a secure position, but I felt that I couldn't achieve any further expansion of mathematical logic there because of the entrenched interests. So I started looking elsewhere. I ruled out several countries for various reasons, but on the positive side, Oxford contacts led me here. Gordon Preston had been appointed to a chair in mathematics at Monash in 1963. And before that, he used to attend the same seminars as me in Oxford. In turn, he invited Peter Neumann for a term's visit. Peter was my contemporary, and in Monash, he gave a course on mathematical logic in 1967. I first came to Australia in 1968 on a visit, and to cut a very long story short, I was elected to a chair in pure mathematics then, a post I took up the following year. Just one anecdote. In the interview, where I was sitting on the ostensibly intimidating sole chair at one side of a huge table with the interviewing committee opposite, I was taken to task. Someone offered that mathematical logic was abstract and useless, so I pointed out that Alan Turing was responsible for the British computer. Subsequent events showed how useful logic is. At Monash at that time, there was Richard Routley, the late Richard Sylvan, but he was in philosophy, and I didn't know him. In 1971, he moved to the Australian National University, where he remained. In both Oxford and Australia, the philosophical and mathematical aspects of symbolic logic tended to be largely autonomous. Relations between the two camps have varied over time. Sometimes there's been hostility, at others, cordial relation. Richard invited me to the house he'd built with his own hands outside Canberra when I was visiting. Bob Meyer was always a pleasure to be with. When I met Michael McRobbie in 2012, he'd long been in Indiana University, Bloomington, and by that time was their president. He recounted fond memories of the 1974 conference, for which I shall have much to say shortly. Nevertheless, this talk will concentrate on the mathematical side of logic. I've arrived in Australia, and having come from a joint appointment in maths and philosophy, I established contacts with the philosophy department at Monash. That led me into contact with Chris Brickhill, a graduate student at Melbourne. We arranged to meet in Pellegrini's Cafe at the corner of Crossley Street, no known connection in the city. Together, we planned a series of informal lectures on mathematical logic. Chris's professor, the kindly Douglas Gaskin, was terrified we wanted money, but he was reassured that we didn't want any, though he seemed to find the idea incomprehensible at first. We convinced him that we only wanted access to a lecture theatre. At that time, the 4 branches of mathematical logic were model theory, proof theory, recursive function theory, and set theory. Already in the Monash mathematics department, Gordon Preston had been helpful, and we had just the right people to cover most of the 4 areas. There was one exception, proof theory. Jörg Kreisel, who had an enormous influence on mathematical logic, was a frequent visitor to Oxford when I was there. I had one long interview with him, really a monologue from him in all sorts. After that, I sat down and wrote my thesis. But one thing he did say, and that was that I should never do proof theory. More on that later. Coming to Monash, I've been able to bring my graduate student, Chris Ash, with me as a senior tutor, and he was appointed as a lecturer in 73, while Gordon Preston had recruited Neil Williams, who later went to the University of Queensland, and John Stillwell, who had managed to get interested in recursively numeral sets and being supported by a generous supervisor, Bruce Craven at Melbourne, although he was by no means a magician. Bruce's main interest was in optimization. John had then gone to MIT to do his doctorate under Hartley Rogers Jr., from where he returned to Monash. In our lectures, we first presented a historical survey of mathematical logic, while the remaining ones covered the Gödel-Henkin completeness theorem, model theory, Turing machines, recursive functions, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and set theory. Although individuals were responsible for the specific chapters, they were considerably reviewed by all members of the team, first after their presentation at Monash and later in written draft. Ironically, when we presented the lectures at Monash, we had a tidying audience, no more than half a dozen, and that was in the afternoon. When we went to Melbourne to give the lectures on the Thursday evening, about 8 o'clock, I think, we started off with 59, and after 13 weeks, at the end of the course, the numbers were down to about 30. The audience was enthusiastic and stimulating, and after the sessions, we'd go across the road to the pub before returning home. I don't remember which stage we thought we might make a book out of the lectures, but we soon approached Methuen, who at the time, and for a long time afterwards, were publishing a lot of logic, and also at Oxford University Press. Both were interested, but OUP said they would put it out more cheaply, so we continued dealing with them. Our aim was to popularize logic, not to make money. The resulting book was a mere 72 pages. It appeared in 1972 when I was visiting Abilda Road at Cornell. Since then, it has remained in print, Dover taking over the publication quite early on. The next major event was in January, February 1974. The Australian Mathematical Society sponsored summer institutes, and I proposed having one at Monash in the summer of '74. One great facilitator was a grant from the Vice Chancellor. Although I'd been at Monash for a few years, I'd never received the honeymoon grant that two professors usually did. I asked Louis Matheson, the tall, imposing, but very friendly Vice Chancellor, for $10,000, and he said 5. So that was settled in a matter of minutes. The equivalent of 50,000 today, it went a long way. The Summer Institute was to last 6 weeks, an unbelievable length nowadays. The time and the money was equally divided into pure and applied mathematics, the first 3 weeks being principally on logic and the last on applied maths. It was at this point that I realized that the principal concern of this talk is networking. Let me explain. The groundwork for the '74 conference was laid a decade or more earlier. In 1961, I'd attended my first logic conference in Cambridge, hosted by Tim Smiley, which was mainly about modal logic. Then in 1962, I went to the Logic Colloquium in Leeds. Trading on the fact that many top American mathematical logicians were going to the International Congress of Mathematicians in Stockholm, the meeting was organized in Leeds where they might stop over. Alonzo Church, a monumental figure, both in logic and physically, attended. I don't recall him giving a paper, but he chaired sessions. On at least one occasion, at the end of the speaker's allotted 20 minutes, he stood up, his bulk blocking any further disquisition. The speaker just dried up. Also, there was Ray Smulyan. I don't know if he's in any relation to Arthur Smulyan, somebody might tell me later, who did conjuring tricks, something that had earned him a crust while he was a graduate student. Alan Heiting, Georg Kreisel, and Alfred Tarski all presented invited lectures. I gave my first contributed talk, and my thesis was beginning to develop. With the help and backing of Michael Dummett, I argued to be a meeting in Oxford the following year. Michael knew there was NATO funding available, and we secured £900, about $14,000 Australian today. Michael suggested various names, such as Paul Kripke and Helen Brashova. The latter was behind the Iron Curtain, but neither the communists nor NATO objected. In the end, she was unfortunately unable to attend, I think because of illness, and refunded the airfare we sent to her. Arthur Pryor, Bob Bull, Ron Harrop, John Lemon, Mike Creswell, Martin Loeb, Hans Herman, Saul Kripke, Mike Yates, Richard Montague, Harold Brookstein, Kurt Schutter, Hal Wang, all gave talks. The non-Oxford people had mainly been nominated by Michael Dummett, but almost everyone invited came. This was followed by another meeting, and that's the volume I talked about very briefly this morning. This was followed by another meeting in Leicester, where Goodstein was professor in 65. Although I wasn't a local organizer, I was heavily involved. By that time, I had my doctorate, and since the content of my thesis was closely related to that of Jim Decker and Neil Road, I invited them. But we also had the partition of Jerry Sachs, Hartwig Rogers Jr., whom I mentioned earlier, Peter Hasenjager, Noel Jensen, Hein Gateman, Simon Koshin, Carol Karp, Bill Lovere, Joe Muscovakis, Alistair Lapland, and Dana Scott. As I've written elsewhere, on meeting the road, I took an instant dislike to him, and subsequently we've been friends ever since, not to mention working closely together for more than 30 years. Americans told me that Hartwig Rogers did not fly, but he came this time, though he didn't stay long. This time, I think all the people invited accepted. Moreover, they funded themselves. In addition, my first doctoral student, Peter Axel, gave it. The reason these people were invited is that their work had become known to us one way or another, in particular through the DLMPS of the IUHPS, that's the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science, meeting in Jerusalem in '64, which I'd attended and where I first learned about models and ultragravics. Simon Koshin talked about me, and that ultimately led to John Bell and Alan Slumpton's book of that name. There too I met and spent pleasant time with Paul Cohen and his wife. Cohen's invention of forcing, and I mentioned this this morning also, which he used to prove the independence of the action of choice and the continuum hypothesis, had perplexed the distinguished gathering of logicians at the Oxford '63 meeting, where after an hour or more struggle, we were unable to understand what was going on. The groundwork had therefore been laid for the 1975 for the 1974 conference. I was greatly assisted in preparations by two of my then research students, Liz Wax, now Sonnenberg, and Bill Gross. I was also very ably supported by the secretarial staff in the mathematics department, especially my own secretary, Anne-Marie Vandenberg. At one stage, the chairman of the department, Bruce Morton, took me to task, complaining that I'd been using all the departmental secretaries for the conference. It was certainly true that I had help from every single one of them at one time. I was not aware at the time of just how much work I was creating for them, but Liz Sonnenberg later pointed out forcefully that her thesis would have been finished much earlier had it not been for the demands of the conference. Everyone invited accepted the disciplinary proceedings, except Abraham Robinson. I had delighted, he's the non-standard models person, non-standard arithmetic and all that. I delighted in that he's a volunteer company at St. Catherine's College, Oxford, before I left. But now he had pancreatic cancer and was suffering a great deal of pain. It was reported to me that he was bitterly disappointed not to be able to come to Australia. In fact, he died 3 months later. As part of the strategy to get people to talk at the Summer Institute, had arranged for Monroe to come on a visit before the Institute started, for Mike Morley, also from Cornell, to come early too. Since this was Mike and his wife Vivienne's first visit to Australia, and Monroe was keen to see us on the outback, made a trip north, getting far as New Inji and Broken Hill. On the way back, we got disastrously bogged near the, as we found out later, the notorious Lattin River. But with the help of fellow travellers, we managed to push and pull all the vehicles to dry land. What we hadn't known about was the speed at which the river near which we were camping could rise as a result of the very heavy rains that occur when it does rain. Fortunately, we chosen our campsite carefully, sufficiently far from the river and not overhung by branches of eucalypt trees, which are prone to these steep banks without rain. Accommodation for the Summer Institute was in Mannix College, an independent hall of residence just across the main road from the university. All the lectures and other sessions were held there too. Thus began an association with CLS. The Summer Institute was wonderfully successful. There were more than 250 participants, the majority coming for the first 2 or 3 weeks of the logic exam. Officially, there were 3 parts to the pure mathematics section of the program. The Summer School of Mathematical Logic was intended to be instructional for those who had not had the opportunity to study mathematical logic before, but on the other hand, we had a symposium on recursive model theory. This was a subject that didn't exist at the time the exposure was planned. Emil Nerode and his Greek student, George Metakides, had started building on the work of Froelich and Shepherdson, developing recursive algebra. Algebra, where instead of being given this structure abstractly, you can explicitly compute values. Of course, that's very abstract and non-magician. I had an interest in the area because of my own work on constructive order types, starting my thesis, and especially because of later work with Nerode. The greatest virtue of the symposium on recursive model theory that there were no lectures, no tutorials, indeed no formal sessions at all. Absolutely nothing was scheduled. What I did do was to invite people who were interested in it and put them in the compact environment of Mannix College, where people would inevitably meet and talk. There were even little rooms at the corners of the quadrangular building where informal sessions could take place. The greatest success of all was only made public when the proceedings were published as volume 450 of the Springer Lecture Notes. On the evening of Tuesday, the 15th of January, 74, and you can work out exactly how long ago that is, the following met in my office to reminisce about the rise of mathematical logic. Chen-Chung Chang, Jerry Kiesler, Steve Cleaney, Mike and Vivian Murray, Andrzej Mostovsky, Emil Nerode, and Gerald Sachs. Peter Hilton was unable to come that evening, but later spoke about Alan Turing, whom we've known. I'd arranged a supply of excellent wine and had a tape recorder ready but unannounced. After a few drinks, I asked if people would mind if I tape recorded the session. No one objected. Here is here's one of the highlights. You'll find the transcript of the conversation in the conference volume. That transcription, not the easiest job, was actually done by the aforesaid two graduate students, Liz Sonnenberg and Bill Gates. So here's Steve Kleene talking about Churchill's thesis of the 30s. You'll recall this is the claim that all the computable, or to put it another way, effectively calculable functions can be generated by Turing machines, or the lambda calculus, or Gödel's recursive function schema. Essentially, that whatever general method you think of as giving computable functions, natural numbers, use exactly the same function. As Church put it in his 1936 paper, quotes, the purpose of the present paper is to propose a definition of effective calculability, which is thought to correspond satisfactorily to the somewhat vague intuitive notion in terms of which the problems of this class are often stated. The footnote is where Church mentions the definitions, different definitions of effectively calculable.
Gödel had this notion of general recursive functions, and the question came up, well, does this embrace all effectively calculable functions? And is it equivalent to the lambda definability? Well, as I say, the first for us, the first concept of lambda definability, it was after the fact, after having formulated the notion of lambda definable function is simply the ones for which you could find formulas in the symbolism, and discovering that everything you thought of that you wanted to prove lambda definable, you could, that it was Church. I have to give the credit to Church. I can't take it myself. I said, well, don't you think maybe we really got all the effectively calculable functions? Then Gödel arrived in the scene with another concept, and there must have been discussion between Church and Gödel, and I don't know how ready Gödel was to embrace the thesis that they were all effectively calculable functions. But the Church, of course, is the one that certainly came out explicitly with this. And then it was a simple narrative.
Oops, sorry, guys.
And we certainly did our work before we ever heard what Turing did, of course, Post. I guess Post probably knew what we heard.
Church's thesis doesn't sort of offhand remark it.
Well, he spent some months sweating over it and saying, "Don't you think it's so?" And I was a skeptic. And when he came out and asserted the thesis, I said, "You can't do that. So I went home and I thought I would diagonalize myself out of the class of the non-definable functions and get another effectively calculated function. It wasn't non-definable. Well, just in one night, I realized that you couldn't do that. And from that point on, I was a convert. But I hadn't thought. Until church really came out and said so, I hadn't really thought of. I guess I hadn't really believed it would be all of it.
The year after the conference, Mostovsky went to another IUH Press meeting in London, Ontario, visited Margarita Dubiel in Simon Fraser University of Canada, and died there shortly afterwards on 22nd of August 1975. He was only 62. Polish logicians later told me that Mostovsky had never been so open in his remarks as he was on the tape. And you can now listen to the whole of that tape. The links are on the AAL advert site for today's talk. And the transcription is also available, freely available. The year after, right. Saul Fefferman has an interesting account about Mostovsky in the memorial volume that Aaron Foyt Maddox and Sir Edmund edited. It was fortunate that Saul managed to get to the Maddox conference because he was detained at Melbourne Airport while the authorities telephoned me to vouch for him. When I wrote that, I didn't realize the situation that was going to develop about our tennis player. In advertising the 74 conference, we sent actual letters, to all 2,000 or so members of the Association of Symbolic Logic. We had one response. That was from Ben Nedris in the Philippines, who'd done his doctorate under Saul Fefferman at Stanford. He invited me to Manila, and that initiated a friendship that still endures. Although the relationship helped the development of mathematics in the Philippines, it only produced one edition. My very last student was who graduated in 2010. However, this led to contacts with logicians throughout Southeast and East Asia. Contacts with North American logicians had begun in '63 with Eric Tariq, and these were developed in 2005. 1975 was a particularly spectacular year in many ways. I was able to take study leave and chose to spend part of the time in Europe and part in the Philippines. There were a couple of interesting conferences in Europe. The first was the Logic Colloquium at Clermont-Ferrand in the Massif Central in France in July '75. Immediately before the conference, I was in Munich visiting Schutter, who had been at the 1963 Oxford conference. He told me that his student Martin Wiersen was also going to Clermont-Ferrand. Martin had a small Volkswagen Golf named for the win, not the game, which just accommodated Martin, his then wife Martine, me and our luggage. Martin and I took the train to Clermont-Ferrand for a conference, which was a long one, taking more than a week. Partly it meant meeting old friends, partly making new ones, as this was the first European conference I'd attended since migration to Australia. There must have been well over 100 participants in the conference, and it was a truly European logic program, whose representatives from both East and West. I remember Margarita Dubiel from Poland, who married Alison Lackland from Simon Fraser. She'd been a student of Victor Marek, who in turn was a student of Mostovsky, and I think they'd met at the 75 conference. There was also Arndt Trilster, a Dutchman who was never attracted with his, to my mind, catalogue style papers. Trilster was being heavily promoted by Kreisel, and at the time, in the way that Kreisel had his current favorite. So Trilster was expected to be some sort of star, I think. He certainly made a mark, and Martin Wunder will tell you about that. Kreisel's own lecture was one that is most remembered from the conference. This is not because of its content. Indeed, I wonder if anyone at all can recall any of the content. It was delivery that made it memorable. Kreisel, out of deference to the host country, began in French. After about 15 minutes, he switched to English with some rather brief acknowledgement that the majority of the audience could understand it. But he ended the lecture in German, thereby ensuring that virtually no one understood the whole lecture. In fact, Kreisel's brand of English with its heavily Germanic style syntax, I should perhaps say Austrian, with many dependent clauses is enough to defeat most of the speakers. By the time the weekend arrived, Martin Viersen and I teamed up with Martin's friend Petrikhaus, who was also German. Peter could speak English but had no French, so we were a trio with 2 languages each, but none in common. A great deal of translation was required. Within a day or two, I found myself doing simultaneous English-French for versa translation. It was astounding to me who had not even been speaking or thinking French a week or two before. Later, John Shepherdson, who was also at the conference, recounted that he too had been doing a lot of translation. He found himself in a couple of Japanese editions. John had the dubious honor of translating the English of each Japanese so that the other could understand. During the last week of the conference, a group of us, including Jane Bridge, later Jane Fisker, who'd been my student in Oxford that completed her degree with Robin Candy, had rented a Citroën DS car, and a group of them ended up at the same local restaurant several nights in a row. The restaurant's patron, seeing that we'd tried all the dishes on the menu, offered to do a special meal for us and finally invited us to go there again. And actually did so and showed us a very fine nice meal. After the conference, I continued what was a very extensive tour of Europe. After a visit to Spain, including Granada, I went across Europe to Poland. I was going to a second conference on set theory and hierarchy theory in September '75. Before that, however, I was invited to Warsaw. I flew in rather than taking the train across communist Germany. The customs examination was thorough and very slow. This was my only time behind the Iron Curtain. The people I met were splendid, but the atmosphere was indeed strange. I was first taken to Warsaw briefly. I was staying right in the center of Warsaw, very close to the Palace of Culture, Stalinist edifice. The local story was that the best place from which to view Warsaw was from this Palace of Culture. Then one could not see the Palace of Culture. I tried to buy a Polish dictionary at a bookshop across the square. The shelves had few books, and I only succeeded in obtaining a tiny French-Polish dictionary. However, the dictionary included pronunciation guides. There I discovered how beautifully and precisely phonetic written Polish is. Of course, there were and still are difficulties pronouncing items such as shirt, which was supposed to be shirt and immediately followed by church, which is very hard for a native English speaker. On the other hand, I said pronounced church, once heard was never forgotten, so the logic of the combination still eludes me. From Warsaw, I was taken by road first to Wrocław, and then to the conference itself, which was at Wiertowicza, at the foot of the mountains in Silesia. It was held in a house called Szczyt, which was a trial for Northwestern students. The conference, delightful, and the polls wonderful and critical. There were great shortages, but nevertheless they fed extremely well. The black market was obviously flourishing, although the general answer in the shops was "nie ma," there isn't any. This perhaps explained the lack of books in the Warsaw bookstore. On the other hand, we did one evening succeed in obtaining Russian champagne at the local cafe. Quite good. Most evenings, we used to go in quite a large group to walk through the forest and the slopes of the Silesian mountains. We were very close to the Czech border, and in fact, we turned back on one occasion by a Czech border guard who felt we were getting too close to the border. After walking for a while, someone always managed to produce vodka, which was then shared around the group. After Wiertowicza, I returned to Warsaw briefly and stayed again at the same hotel. In Kaliausia took me to the mathematics department of the Academy of Sciences, which was partly inside the Palace of Culture. And it was there I met Helena Rashova for the one and only time. We talked about her not being able to come to the Oxford conference at 63. At the age of 58, she seemed quite old and fit a mixture of kindness and domination. From what I saw, she was clearly revered by her younger companions. After Warsaw, I was invited to Krakow by Stanisław Soma. He started a logic journal in which Lloyd Hummerston, who is here today, and from the philosophy department in Monash, and I subsequently published a paper, The Logic of Action, which I'll say more about shortly. In the strange world of pre-Solidarność Poland, with Stein I was in very good hands. He took me to the Jagiellonian University And we went and saw telescopes and apparatus that belonged to Nicolaus Copernicus. Later, Stan took me to his flat. Sometimes later, Stan left Poland to work in Africa and eventually settled with his family in New Zealand, as some of you know. As a group, all the other Polands were wonderfully warm and amazingly generous with what little they had. I remember them with great affection. After the visit to Poland, went to the Philippines for a couple of months. As I mentioned earlier, Ben Nebris had invited me after my brief visit in '74. My visit to the Philippines continued almost every year thereafter until the pandemic struck. Back at Monash, my work with Lloyd Huddleston on the logical action continued. We eventually produced a paper that applied the possible role of semantics with solved crypto, about which Max Creswell and Hughes wrote a very clear book. All that we did was to take one of the possible roles as the actual in the real world. It's my most cited paper. Martin Davies, a student who went to Oxford and ultimately became professor there, thought it was a trivial exercise. Perhaps simplicity is a virtue. Academic recruiting was becoming more difficult, but I had a study stream of graduate students. In 1979, Jim Decker, who I mentioned before, and his wife visited from Princeton, where they lived, since he worked just a few miles away at Rutgers University, and Princeton's a much nicer place to live in Brunswick. Jim's work with John Myhill on recursive filling his site has been vitally important to me, forming the basis of my thesis work on constitutive order type. In Jim's honor, we had a little conference with papers that appeared as aspects of effective housing work. In 1981, the first Asian Logic Conference was held in Singapore with Chongqing Tak, the main force behind it. 1 hour invited lectures were given by Manny Blairman, Angus McIntyre, sometimes Professor of Logic in Oxford, Neil Rode, Larry Sachs, and myself. In addition, there were 2 workshops, one in recursion theory, conducted by Mark Tamtai from Chulalongkorn University, Thailand, and one in model theory, conducted by Chris Ashton. Rob Goldblatt from New Zealand also gave a talk, as did Michael McRobin. And this was the first time I met Chinese logicians, including Li Xiang from Guizhou University, yet another logician who later moved into computer science. The phenomenon of logicians moving into computer science is not new. From the early 1960s, graduates from Cornell were quickly snapped up in my newly created department for computer science. That was easier than getting a job in the traditional mathematics department as a logician. If I remember correctly, John Staples, who had done his PhD at Bristol with John Shepardson, was in the University of Queensland, and in his move to computer science got involved in program verification in a very practical way, verifying a program to control a heart pacemaker. Program verification, which came to be applied by such people as Jeff Dromey, Wollongong, and later Griffiths, was one of the cases where logic was brought into another discipline. My own move into computer science was somewhat different. It was really a matter of university politics. In 1982, after a complaint from Chris Wallace, the head of computer science, about the way his department was being overworked and starved of funds, a major high-level inquiry chaired by 2 deputy vice chancellors was launched, and that lasted for 2 years. During that time, Chris Wallace, on leaving England, had major heart bypass surgery. I became head of computer science, and eventually led to me slowly moving into that department. Although I'd done recursion theory, which surely is the area of computer science, I'd written only 1 program in my life, in Mercury Autocode. The department was most welcoming, and I modified my interest. Fortuitously, logic programming had developed in the 70s, and Melbourne developed its own variety, constraint logic programming. The chief protagonists here at that time were Jean-Louis Lasset at Melbourne and Jonathan Jaff at Monash. I quickly acquired graduate students in the students in the area. I think it was at a conference in Canberra in 1980 that I first met Alan Robinson, the pioneer of the resolution method, and in particular unification that underlines the logic programming language Prolog. We just bumped into each other at the end of the session. I introduced myself as Crossley, and Alan didn't see it on the logic of the name. My father used to work for a Crossley, he began. Both Alan and I come from Yorkshire, he from Halifax, where there are lots of Crossley. After that initial salvo, we were soon talking about technical matters. As it happens, while as a graduate student doctor, Hal Wong, who soon after moved to Rockefeller University, had got us to study Abrahams' thesis, the source of the unification method. This is the copy I bought in Black Oak Bookshop in Oxford all those years ago. We became good friends, and Alan visited Monash, where he gave a very entertaining lecture on Albert's cap. This title comes from the famous Stanley Holloway monologue about a boy who got eaten by a lion and Bell Blackburn, soon leaving only his cap as evidence. They told what had happened to Albert and proved it by showing his cap. I've no record of that talk, but I'll shortly come to a later visit by Alan. The presence of Jackson Jaffer at Monash, who's only we last there at Melbourne Uni, led to great developments in constraint logic programming, combining logic programming with real number arithmetic, even to the extent of IBM giving Monash a significant amount of money for rights to the system. More about logic programming shortly. In 1984, in some ways echoing the 1974 conference, Jackson Jaffer and I ran a conference on logic and computation. Again, we were blessed because, so far as I can remember, all the international invitees accepted. This time the list included Jeff Remmel, Joris Harmanis, David Harrell, Keith Clark, who's shown perched on the stage in this slide, Krzysztof Abt, Anil Narod, Zaha Mana from Stanford, Yang Dongping from Beijing, and Yuri Gurevich, who moved to Microsoft in 1998. The other highlight of the conference for me was a meal at Steels Creek in the bush, 60 kilometers from the city centre, where we managed to carry 17 people around a large dining table. Unfortunately, James Scott didn't make it because the airline wouldn't let him on the plane. He had not applied for a visa, at least they behaved properly that time. I continued my work with Anil Narod, and we visited each other often, especially in the 90s. Our work shifted because of the work of John E. Girard and strong normalization of written order logic. The import of that was a new way of proving the consistency of second order logic. Anil and I spent a lot of time on this thesis, and that eventually led to what I believe a more transparent way of doing the proof. John Shepherdson, who'd been one of my thesis examiners in Oxford and a visitor to Australia on more than an occasion, and I reworked Girard's thesis in terms of the more usual formulation of second order logic, rather than using Girard's rather terse and triptych formulation. This was taken into a new area involving computer states by my students Iman Ponomo in his thesis that developed into our book with Martin Pearson. Academically, being in the computer science department, worked in both directions. I got to know more about logic in computer science, and the computer science students got more logic. The syllabus moved from the basic consideration of Boolean algebra necessary for circuit theory and information theory a la Shannon to a wider consideration of logic, in particular its relation to algorithms. The work of Girard and others lead into a new generation of theorem proving, obtaining algorithms from proofs. In a way, things have come full circle since the time that Hal Wong had been on leave from Oxford, and he used an IBM 704 computer to prove several hundred theorems in proposition logic from Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. Incidentally, Hal Wong always espoused formal methods rather than heuristic ones, and his formal approach seems to be much more effective. Teaching logic in a computer science environment is very instructive. I had an excellent assistant called Joel Riker, who taught me much about the computer science about the way computer science students thought. That was very different from the way mathematicians thought. There are two major differences. On the one hand, mathematicians learned all the techniques first and only later how to apply them. Computer science students did not learn techniques until they needed to use them. On the other hand, proofs were alien to computer scientists, but algorithms were not. The timing of my interest in extracting programs from proofs a la Girard led me to look at the relationship between proofs and programs, not just abstractly, but practically also. I endeavored as much as possible to provide constructive proofs, which almost look like algorithms, as much as possible, studiously avoiding proof by contradiction. In 1997, Alan Robinson made another visit to Monash, and on 19th of March, he spoke about the development of logic program. Alan's describing how things all came together from Airbrandt's property A, which you can find buried on page 93 of this thesis. He used that in work of Davidson Putnam and also Jack Travis. Okay, so let me show you a little of that video, and let's hope this works properly.
To co-routine these things. And then I kept sort of, playing around with that combination, and suddenly it dawned on me that you could take this one rule, this resolution pattern at the Boolean level, and just look for ways in which two instances would occur from two mother clauses so that you could apply that rule. So there you're looking at clauses that didn't get instantiated yet, and you ask, how could I unify things in these two clauses so that the result would have this simple cut rule applied to it? Well, you know the rest of the story. I mean, there is this answer say, yeah, you can do that. You just look at all the different ways you can instantiate this rather small amount of material, and if any one of them creates a cut opportunity, you take that cut, and the result is logical consequence of what you started with. Well, so that was very nice, but the main part of the work was showing that this rule and this alone would be a complete system for unsatisfiability of logic. And that was the tough part, and I felt quite unhappy until I saw a way to do the completeness there. And my 65 paper, Introducing Resolution, was basically setting things up in an ultra cautious way so that a dumbbell like me was not going to make an error in this thing. I felt, that I've been trusted with this great idea, and I got to get it right. And so I really worked on getting that thing. Well, I think it still stands today as a fairly clear demonstration that this thing is complete.
Let me now go back to the PowerPoint. Sorry. Okay. By this time, the late 90s, I was doing less logic and more history. My last student, Lita Cruz, and I had remarkable difficulty getting his work published. What it seemed to be an elegant and simple double-decker logic with systems down here which communicated up here seemed to perplex the organizers of various conferences we approached. In the end, however, we got the Best Paper Award at the 2009 International Conference on Agents and Artificial Intelligence in Porto, Portugal. Over the years, I've also had the pleasure of having a few students from other places. Than Melbourne. Now, so let me conclude with a few philosophical remarks. What does all this mean? How much has mathematical logic clarified ideas, the notions of mathematics? And why has it been so important for computer science? But as a start, it is worth remembering how Merrick or others contrasted practices of philosophy and history. With philosophy, the problems keep changing. Beautiful. One needs also to keep in mind that philosophers have not, in fact, asked eternal questions. The basic premise, my basic premise, is that logic and mathematics are human activities. The early 20th century division of philosophy of mathematics into Platonism, formalism, intuition is perhaps surprisingly a manifestation of that. There seems to be no need to believe that there is an ideal Platonic world underlying the real world, because all our actions take place in the real world. This is not to deny that systems-based theories have a life of their own. Witness the convergence of the definitions of effectively calculable that Steve Kleiner talked about. However, in order to communicate about mathematics and logic, we need to engage in intersubjective activity, to use Peter Paul's phrase. If there's sufficient communication between two people, then we believe that we understand each other and we can investigate phenomena together. For this, it's essential to both know and agree on the rules of engagement. Imre Lakatos gave a delightful analysis of the proof of the Euler formula, vertices plus faces minus edges equals 2 for a three-dimensional rectilinear solid. He showed how over time, the proof had changed as people made more precise the notion of a three-dimensional rectilinear solid. For a start, it had to be convex. And the present formulation of the theory now involves complex polytopes that we all usually think of ordinary solids such as cube, tetrahedra, etc. This process of refining definitions is more commonly thought of in relation to physical sciences, but it also occurs and is necessary in mathematics. The prime example of a definition that needs refining is that of a set. Axiomatic formulations of set theory have never succeeded in giving a definitive idea of the set in the past, and it seems unlikely that they will do so in the future. Nevertheless, we can get a lot of use out of set theory. Let me turn briefly now to the other two divisions. Formalism claims that mathematics is simply a game, but it has been argued that it's far too much of practical use for that to be the case. Unfortunately, that argument has been undermined. The argument of the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics collapses when we see why particular varieties of mathematics are developed. They flourish because they're useful. So it's important to note that their usefulness may not be in the solving of, say, engineering problems, but abstract problems in higher subfields. If we adopt a more human approach, then we can see that formalism in mathematics, that is, say, the use of formulae, etc., is a great benefit to human endeavor, and the correlations between abstract ideas and physical phenomena work well enough together. I remember being shocked by physicists simply neglecting singularities of functions they were using. People like Dirac managed to develop theories that resolve some of those problems. The case of intuitionism is somewhat different. Although it was conceived by Brouwer, it sounds more like a religious creed than the philosophy of mathematics. The technical approach has been immensely fruitful, not least in computer science. As I mentioned earlier, the way I now look at mathematical proofs in computer science is guided by looking at the algorithms involved, and those algorithms are of their very essence constructive, conforming to intuitionistic logic. So we now have two common kinds of logic within mathematics, mathematical logic, classical and constructive or intuitionistic. I believe this simple development came about because of the cultural approach. In Europe, the way European mathematicians thought is crucial. When we look at Indian logic, its complexity, as somebody remarked earlier today, is bewildering. And in my practical experience, seems quite bewildering or confusing even to its practitioners. On the other hand, Western developments have led to other kinds of logic. The waves of quantum physics led to development of quantum logic. Philosophers, and many of you here today, have developed various kinds of modern logic. All of these are human activities, and they're used to clarify what is going on in different areas of physics. As I said in my paper, Samsara, I expect many different kinds of logic to develop in the near future. I do not expect any one logic to be definitive in the way that magicians of the early 20th century felt. I do expect the logics to be judged for their usefulness in selected areas. Wittgenstein famously said that the meaning is the use. It took me a long time to parse that English sentence, but it seems more accurate than his earlier claims that what can be said clearly. The clarity of a concept is something that is capable of changing over time and according to the environment. To me, the usefulness of mathematical logic is in helping to clarify ideas, a very necessary human activity. And what is mathematical logic continues. Despite their savage 1976 review, Corker and Shapiro acknowledged this highly praised book, and it does indeed seem to have stood the test of time. There are already versions for Bulgarian, Italian, Japanese, and Spanish. This one's for you, Guillermo, if you haven't got it already.
Oh, no, I don't have it.
And the latest translation is the Chinese one. And my copy actually just arrived yesterday. Is it time for a second edition?
I think so, yes.
Let me end with the words of the director of the UNESCO promoting this World Logic Day and one final comment. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks very much, John. So guys, let's join on thanking John. That was very nice. So now if you have questions, please exactly type in the chat. So Martin, please go ahead.
You're on mute again, Martin.
You have to unmute yourself here.